How the Jews Betrayed Mankind. Volume 1, The Sumerian Swindle, 2nd edition, by G_D, Chapter 3, The Sumerian Swindle, Ancient Secret of Wealth and Power. Recording right in the middle of a thunderstorm. You readers who are bankers or Jews or other assorted thieves and con artists might want to skip this chapter since you already know how to betray your country and defraud your people. But for those of you who don't like being enslaved and impoverished, learning something about how the Jews do it can save your health, your wealth, your family, your people, and your nation. First, we must understand some basic cogs in the machinery that makes the Sumerian swindle work. I am writing down these secrets for the very first time in history, so if you didn't think of them first yourself, then perhaps it is because these secrets are too simple for a modern person to understand. Or perhaps you have taken them for granted because they have always been here. The Sumerian swindle started like this. If you are on good terms with your next-door neighbor, and you run short of some flour or eggs in the middle of cooking supper, a neighborly thing to do is run next door or send your children next door to borrow what you need until you can go to the market and restock supplies. After shopping, you will repay your neighbor for the borrowed food. Such borrowing among neighbors has been going on ever since people began living together in groups. That is, for the past 10 or 20 million years. Borrowing and repaying is a way to build friendships and to sustain society. Borrowing and repaying is a vital mechanism in every human society, but it became corrupted among the Ubaidians of Mesopotamia. As the people whom we call the Ubaidians first practiced irrigated cultivation of crops, something about this natural human relationship changed. Perhaps one neighbor got tired of constantly lending out grain to another neighbor who was slow to repay. So it happened that at a certain time, the lending neighbor agreed to lend out a measure of grain only if the borrower agreed to repay a measure and a handful. Or perhaps a basket of grain was lent out in return for a basket and a half in repayment. Or perhaps, sensing the reluctance of a neighbor to loan, the borrower himself, out of charitable goodwill and personal need, offered to repay 2 baskets of grain for one loaned. Whatever the actual origin of the mechanism, the Ubaidians evolved a system that we today call interest on a loan. This occurred sometime between 9000 and 6000 BC when they first began building their permanent mud brick towns and villages. Central grain storehouses were a part of every town, and in every town and village, individual grain storage space was a part of every house. So when the larder was empty, borrowing from a neighbor kept starvation from the door and promoted friendly relations among neighbors in a harmonious society of give and take. But something else occurred in the actual understanding of this development in the minds of both the borrower and the lender. A borrower who repays the loan has nothing left in his hands to contemplate, but the lender who gains back the loan plus interest has more than he started with to contemplate. The poor man is even poorer than he was, and the rich man is richer than he was. The actual physical ownership of the grain plus interest enabled the lender to accumulate an ever-increasing store of goods. In addition to what he started with, both the returned loan as well as the interest could be loaned out at interest, and that interest, when repaid, could again be loaned out in a spiraling increase in total wealth. This was the beginning of the Sumerian swindle, the charging of simple interest on a loan. 2 baskets of grain on a loan at 50% interest brought back 3 baskets. These 3 could again be loaned at 50% interest to bring back 4.5. These 4.5 could again be loaned to bring back 6 3/4. In short time, those original 2 baskets produced an additional 4 3/4 baskets of grain for free. And so on, as an increasing spiral of profits accumulated for free and for doing no work other than making loans. As the size and number of loans increased, the total wealth of the grain lender began to increase far beyond the wealth of his neighbors. Then a magical and mysterious thing happened. Once a certain profit point had been reached where the lender was loaning out not his original grain, but the grain that he had previously received as interest, then everything that he profited from that point onward was wealth given to him for free. The grain that he received as interest on the loan had cost him nothing. and when he loaned out that same grain at interest, both it and its returning interest were free grain that had also cost him nothing. This free grain continued to multiply over time as it was loaned out again and again. Huge mountains of grain filling his storerooms to the rafters began to accumulate, grain that had cost him absolutely nothing more than charging interest on a loan. In those days, a man's wealth was measured by how much land and grain he had and by how many goats and sheep that he owned. Very soon, those Ubaidian grain lenders were enjoying vast fortunes. Thanks to the arithmetic deception of lending at interest, they were loaning out, at interest, what they had gotten for free. Eventually, using that free grain in barter for other goods, everything that they owned actually had cost them absolutely nothing at all. The lender found that by loaning out a basket of grain, he had got back 2 baskets instead. Of course, a light bulb did not go off in his head, since it was still the Stone Age, 7,000 years before Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Edison. But certainly the very first loan shark had a major brainstorm. Without working under the hot sun, without lifting a single load upon his head, without walking a single step, 2 baskets of grain were delivered to his door. And the one who delivered the grain was glad to do it, since the loan had helped him through a difficult time. After all, they were all fellow villagers and all on good relations with one another. The hatreds would come much later. Grain could be bartered for goats, and goats for woven cloth and boats and goats and grain could be exchanged for houses and irrigated land, etc. By loaning grain out at interest and using the interest income to barter for other goods, a clever trader could leverage his way to more wealth than any of his neighbors, even though all of them had started off at the same level in society. Like the modern bankers who pile up their swindled wealth into skyscrapers, yachts, and Learjets, investments in war and cornering the commodities market, the Ubaidian moneylenders began to pile up wealth in grain, silver, and land. Whether as an ancient grain dealer or as a modern banker, they got all of this swindled wealth for free. By getting something for nothing simply by charging interest on a loan, they had discovered secret fraud number 1 of the Sumerian Swindle. All interest on the loan of money is a swindle. It might seem odd, but the fact is that all of the excessive wealth of modern-day bankers, financiers, loan sharks, Jews, and related swindlers is based upon nothing more than 2 baskets of barley creating 3. Secret fraud number 1 of the Sumerian Swindle was based upon what people all over the world had been doing for millions of years. If one member of a village or tribe was short of supplies, other members would give or loan him what he needed, and when he was able, he would return the borrowed goods or else return goods of equal value. But to insist that he return more than he had borrowed was the swindle. In all farming communities where drought, insects, fire, rain, flooding, and a myriad of woes plague farmers, there are always farmers who need a loan to get through the bad spell. Lending and paying back, borrowing and returning, have always been a part of normal human society. At first, this normal and natural system was used in Mesopotamia. If a farmer needed a basket of grain for his family, he would borrow it from a neighbor, and when the harvest came in, he would repay what he had borrowed. This was a natural and a balanced exchange system. No one profited and no one lost, yet the entire community benefited. Goods were distributed in an equitable way, which was good and natural and fair to everybody. However, once a lender asked for more in return than what he had lent, an unnatural imbalance was introduced into society. No longer were men equal and dependent upon their work for their material rewards in life. Interest on a loan created the inequality of those who became rich without actually working for their wealth, and those who became poor in spite of incessant labor. In other words, charging interest on a loan automatically created a diseased situation in society where the rich sucked the life out of the poor. It created 2 social classes of financial vampires, living off of the blood and sweat of the permanently impoverished. Why is lending at interest an unnatural phenomenon? That it is unnatural can be seen by looking at nature herself. Making loans by those who have to those who do not have is a natural attribute of all beings who live in social groups. No matter what creatures or even what forms of symbiotic animal or plant life that you care to study, you will find that lending and paying back is one of the characteristics that keep societies both strong and prosperous. Ants and bees create huge societies of individual members who make loans to one another as a part of their daily life. Indeed, without loans, the bee and ant colonies would have died out hundreds of millions of years ago. When an ant is hungry, she approaches another member of her colony, taps a few appropriate messages with her antenna against the antenna of her sister ant, and if this sister ant has food in her stomach, she will regurgitate a portion and give it to the hungry one to eat. In this manner, enormous amounts of labor and time are saved, since the hungry ant does not have to travel back to the colony for a meal, but can approach the lunch wagon no farther than the nearest worker. Thus, the colony can extend its power over a greater scavenging area through this mutual system of colony-wide food distribution and sharing. In many more ways, this loaning of food between ants gives the entire colony more power, success, and prosperity. Later, after she has eaten her fill back at the colony food larder, or from scavenged foods found in the field, the borrowing ant eventually returns food from its stomach to whatever hungry sister ant who asks. The same is true for bees. Thus, it can be seen that loaning and borrowing and paying back are all part of animal social groups that increase the prosperity and survivability of the entire colony. No individual loses and no individual gains because it is a balanced and a natural system in which all members benefit. Not a single one of those humble insects ever asks for more than it needs, nor does it amass for itself a special hoard of crumbs or honey stashed in a private and secret hideaway that is a result of taking but of not giving back. The ants and bees have been making interest-free loans to one another for 1 billion years, and they have thrived as social creatures. Ancient man also has borrowed and loaned and paid back. As a result, everybody has benefited and everybody has survived. But modern man has been charging interest on loans for the past 5,000 years, and we are racked with warfare, famine, disease, ecological destruction, and many other social catastrophes, while the fat bankers preen themselves in their luxury chalets and counting houses. Chalets. Let me look that up real quick. I want to make sure I didn't screw that up. Chalet, a wooden house or cottage with overhanging eaves typically found in the Swiss Alps. Chalet. I did mess it up. French word. While the fat bankers preen themselves in their luxury chalets and counting houses. This is all a result of the Sumerian Swindle. Even a lowly lichen adhering to a rock is a higher and more natural form of life Even a lowly lichen adhering to a rock is a higher and more natural form of life form than is a moneylender, financier, banker, or Jew. Mankind is a social creature who makes loans to his fellows. Perhaps the hunt for game was not lucky for one family group, so they would share in the roasted gazelle that their neighbor had caught that day. And when they were lucky in the hunt, they would share their fresh deer meat with that same neighbor who had not been lucky, or else share a basket of grain or acorns or berries. In this way, mankind as a social creature was able to thrive through the power of mutual helpfulness and sharing, making loans to one another and paying back. Gave the entire tribe more resiliency and strength. If one had food, all had food. In this way, everybody lived through mutual help and no one died through neglect. But woe to the greedy or selfish tribe members who were antisocial by refusing to share what they had. Woe to those who borrowed but did not give back. They became ignored and ostracized. They were known as takers. They only took but did not give back. And if they didn't get the social message when their own wants were rebuffed, then eventually they became outcasts and perished alone in the wilderness with no tribe to sustain them. In this way, natural selection improved mankind as a social creature. Like the ants and bees who shared in mutual prosperity, mankind was also at one with nature as he used loans and sharing for greater group strength and solidarity. Love of one's neighbor was expressed through giving, and through giving and sharing, strong personal and social bonds were forged, providing the ancient people with strength against all adversaries. To fully understand the Sumerian swindle, throw aside your conditioning and your take-it-for-granted state of mind, and understand this idea of interest on a loan from a new perspective. The first secret fraud of the Sumerian swindle is, all interest on the loan of money is a swindle. That's right, every banker and moneylender is a deceiving thief and a cruel swindler, although he tries to keep this fact hidden. So, to make it easy to understand, simplify, simplify. In the modern times, the Sumerian swindle is like the old shell game of hiding a pea under a shell. This game is so simple, just one pea and 3 walnut shells. And yet the pea gets lost from view both by the mixing up of the walnut shells, but also by the deft manipulations of the huckster using sleight of hand. A good street hustler using nothing but 3 walnut shells and a pea can separate the gawking suckers from their money in a short time if they place their bets on the wrong shell, because he can always make sure that it is the wrong shell. To repeat, all interest on the loan of money is a swindle. And the moneylenders and bankers are all criminals. Part of the trick in their black art is that moneylenders have been around since Mesopotamian times, so that these parasites have been taken for granted and accepted as a normal part of society. But bankers are not at all normal. They are all crooks. However well dressed and honest they pretend to be, the bankers are no different than a street hustler manipulating a pea among walnut shells. But to make the game more to their benefit, they manipulate trillions of peas between billions of walnut shells, so that no one seems to be able to keep track of where all the money goes except themselves. That all of the money disappears into the bankers' pockets isn't noticed in the confusion caused by some winners and some losers milling about and wondering what happened to the economy. To illustrate the Sumerian swindle, and for the sake of unraveling this ancient mystery in a simple way, let's assume that there is only one moneylender in the whole world and only 2 pieces of money. The 2 pieces of money can be lumps of gold or silver, pennies, francs, yuan, Reichsmarks, dollars, whatever name you wish to use for them. But there are only 2 of them. I could use $2 for this example, or even 2 pennies, but since the Mesopotamians used weights of silver in their system of exchange, let's do the same for this as well as for the examples given later. A shekel weight of silver was about 1/3 ounce, or about 8 grams. Let's assume that there are only 2 shekels of silver in the whole world. Now suppose that there are 2 men who want to borrow from the Mesopotamian banker 1 shekel of silver each. Either they are merchants or farmers, or perhaps only a parent wishing to have a big wedding party and a dowry for a beloved daughter. Each man goes to the banker to borrow 1 shekel of silver, which the banker loans at 50% interest for 1 year. Now remember, for the sake of this illustration, there are only 2 shekels of silver in the entire world. At 50% interest for each shekel, that means that each borrower must return 1.5 shekels to the banker at the end of the year. And if each man returns to the banker 1.5 shekels, that adds up to a total of 3 shekels that the banker will have in his hands. But remember, there are only 2 shekels of silver in the entire world. So how can these borrowers return to the banker 3 shekels of silver? In fact, it is impossible. We can see the impossibility when the problem is simplified like this. But this impossibility is hidden from the average man because in reality, the amounts of money are so large and they involve so many borrowers that the swindle is not so easily perceived. And yet, there is always less money available in reality than what the banker demands, because the arithmetic creates something that is not really there. An extra shekel out of thin air. You can call it simple arithmetic, but the ancient moneylenders call it quite simply, Oi Gewalt, a miracle. From this phantom of interest on a loan, all other frauds arose within the Sumerian swindle, a swindle of phantom interest demanding repayment in real goods. Is this not fantastic stuff or what? This is what reading ought to be like, where it's like fun to read, like brain candy or something. As the centuries wore on, and then more centuries wore on, this idea of making loans with an interest charge attached to them became an accepted idea. It was difficult to give a goat for a wedding feast and expect to be paid back 2 goats, or to loan the use of a field and expect 2 fields in return. But if a goat could be given and repaid with a goat plus a basket of grain, then a new kind of bargaining began to evolve. The use of a field could be loaned out with so many baskets of grain given as rent, and so it went. Throughout the hundreds of years before the Sumerians arrived in Mesopotamia, this new system was in place of making loans at interest. At first, the ethics of the Ubaidian moneylenders was not much different than that of their own people. Small towns keep their individual people adhering to society's norms through social pressures and gossip. In the small villages where everybody knew everybody else, it was very rare for one neighbor to steal from or to swindle another without everybody finding out about it. Retribution was either exacted with fisticuffs or death, or the neighborly aggressor would be called before the council of elders or the village chief, and the disagreements would come under public scrutiny. It was social pressure alone that kept those who loaned at interest within a reasonableness that was conducive to social harmony. These are the facts of small village life. If people are to get along, then one citizen cannot be allowed to prey upon another. Strangely enough, for such a dishonest system, moneylending itself depends upon the goodness and honesty of mankind. It posits the proposition that anyone who borrows is obligated by the honor of his name and the holiness of his promise to repay the principal and interest on the loan. This is where the swindle gets most of its power, because it relies upon the borrower being honest. It relies upon the borrower being honorable. It relies upon the borrower being God-fearing and true to his word. But it does not depend upon the lender of money to be any of these things. Thus, secret fraud number 3 was incorporated at an early time. Loans rely on the honesty of the borrower, but not the honesty of the lender. By 4000 BC, not only had the Ubaidians developed small towns and an organized society, but they had also developed into 2 social classes which were named the Awilum, A-W-I-L-U-M, the Haves, or Haves, I think it's Haves, H-A-V-E-S, and the Muskenum, M-U-S-K-E-N-U-M, the Have-Nots. So it was Haves, okay. Awilum, Haves, Muskenum, Have-Nots. This system of getting back more than they lent out developed over a period of more than 1,000 years. So, the incremental change in the wealth and the power of the Awilum, the Haves, over the Muskenum, the Have-Nots, was not noticed since it was so gradually accomplished. Through many generations, rich fathers taught their sons how to parasitize their neighbors, and the poor fathers taught their sons that after borrowing grain from the Awilum, the Haves, that the honest thing to do was to pay back that grain plus interest, because that's how it has always been. Instead of being recognized as an aberration, the system itself began to be accepted as normal. For the Awilum, the Haves, this loan and interest became an asset that could be passed along to his sons, and the original loan that had cost them nothing and which brought them more wealth for free in interest payments could also be passed from one generation to the next as grain, and silver lending families bequeathed to their descendants the fruits of usury as ongoing accounts. Eventually, wealthy families and wealthy individuals arose who, through greed and acquisitive barter, were able to gain a large share of the total wealth of the community. Over many generations, those families became owners of large properties and the employers of many laborers to work those properties. Farms, silver, grain, land, and slaves all became theirs, and they got it all for free. Lending at interest became commonly accepted as an ordinary part of the pre-literate Mesopotamian society simply because it has always been here, quote unquote. The rich insisted on their rights of ownership, and the poor accepted their poverty since it was brought upon them so gradually by the subtlety of the swindle that they didn't notice the decline of their well-being. Later, a new fraud was developed when the farmers could see no reason to pay back loans of grain to lenders who already had more than they needed. As fellow citizens, it didn't seem fair that a rich grain lender would demand payment from a poor farmer who barely had enough to eat. So, the farmers, being honest and fair folks, began to only pay back the principal, but not the interest on the loan. In response, the lenders began to demand that loans at interest be secured with property. As a result, loans that were not repaid plus interest forfeited the farm. In this way, the lenders began to acquire not only more grain and silver, but also more farms as they developed secret fraud number 2. Collateral that is worth more than the loan is the banker's greatest asset. That's secret fraud number 2. Collateral that is worth more than the loan is the banker's greatest asset. It makes you angry just reading it. Social upheaval did not occur immediately because there was still vacant land that could be settled, so that there was still a place for the dispossessed to move to. Through the loaning of grain or silver at interest and then being dispossessed of their farms, the people were forced to dig new irrigation systems and build up the raw land farther from the rivers. Although loaning at interest had worked its inevitable evil, the effects were diluted because there were still places for the people to go. The poor did not rise up and kill the rich, but a greater social distance developed between the rich and the poor. As villages grew into cities, and there was a greater social distance and impersonality between the wealthy who lent money and the poor who borrowed from them, a more callous, ruthless attitude developed in the rich, and a more seething hatred developed in the poor. Once society accepted the legitimacy of collecting interest on a loan, and once the cities grew into more impersonal sizes, the moneylenders were free to take whatever profits they could, even by resorting to force. And force was often necessary when the moneylender wanted to dispossess a family from their lands and possessions. Pulling a struggling child from the arms of a fighting and screaming mother and father required force. Pushing entire families off of their farms required force. And with increased wealth, the moneylenders who did not have enough strong sons and male relatives also became the employers of guards and goons and strong armed gangs of enforcers. The moneylenders could get away with their swindles because they were swindling honest people who mistakenly assumed that the moneylenders also were honest and their loans were legitimate. Secret fraud number 3 of the Sumerian swindle is, loans rely on the honesty of the borrower but not the honesty of the lender. If you have ever inspected a modern credit card contract or any other banking document, there is always fine print. In addition to tiny print that is difficult to read, it is often printed with gray ink, making it even more difficult to decipher. Have you ever wondered why this is so? If the bankers and credit card companies are honest businessmen, then why do they use tricks and deceit in order to trick you into entering into one of their Let me start that over. I need a swig first. Sorry. So why is the fine print on credit card contracts in gray and in so difficult to read? They print it small and in gray ink. If the bankers and credit card companies are honest businessmen, then why do they use tricks and deceit in order to trick you into entering into one of their fraudulent contracts? The question is rhetorical. Basically, banker and credit card companies are all swindlers. Their entire industry is criminal in nature, so secrecy, tricks, and deceit are part and parcel of the bankers' business methods. The methods of modern bankers are built upon the same methods employed by the ancient moneylenders of Sumeria. The bankers themselves are crooks trying to swindle you out of your property, but they demand that you yourself must be honest and true to your word. They present you with a fraudulent contract to sign with stipulates how they are going to steal from you. Oh my goodness. They present you with a fraudulent contract to sign which stipulates how they are going to steal from you. And they expect you to keep the agreement honestly and true, even though they themselves are neither honest nor true. The moneylenders demand that you honestly repay to them with interest what they have dishonestly defrauded from you. This is what modern moneylenders do to you, but it was worse for the people of ancient Mesopotamia. Just as a modern banker can have the sheriff throw you into the street and seize your personal property, for the ancient Mesopotamians, the prospect of slavery was an additional punishment. And so, secret fraud number 3 of the Sumerian Swindle is also one of its best kept secrets. Although the moneylenders are all crooks who defraud you out of your possessions, they hypocritically demand that you, who are their victims, be honest and pay them with your money. Bankers refuse to loan to thieving crooks because stealing money is what the bankers want to do. Life was good and profitable for the Awalum, the haves, as they gained more and more properties and goods through lending at interest. Great wealth tends to demand luxury. It became fashionable for people with wealth to buy the best of clothes and the fanciest of trinkets. Bartering for goods and equating goods to baskets of grain began a system where trade could be accomplished between a variety of goods merely by equating them with an agreed-upon amount of grain. And there was something else among all of the dusty trade goods in that dusty and dry country that was also desirable. That silver metal that was too soft for anything except ornaments for the wife and shiny cups and trinkets had a true value also. Silver was more rare than baskets of grain and had to be imported from distant lands. Because of its rarity, a small amount of silver could be traded for large amounts of grain or for goats or lands or horses. The trade ratio between this shiny metal and what people were willing to trade for it was quite high. Soon it was accepted that a purse containing a few shekels weight of silver was equal to huge piles of grain, numerous goats and sheep, oxen, fields of barley, houses, and any other things for which men and women bartered and traded. Thus, silver became a useful and relatively lightweight method for exchanging goods. Although not a true form of money, silver became a type of commodity money. Silver was not valuable because of any intrinsic value in and by itself, but simply because men and women desired to have it. As a shiny commodity, it could be made into a ring or a bracelet. Or it could be an in-between trade good, such as in trading a goat for some silver in one town and that same silver for some jars of beer in another town. And because it could be used to buy anything, it became the most desirable of all things because it could be traded for all things. In ancient Sumeria, silver could be traded for anything. Shiny metals all came from outside of Mesopotamia. These imports of silver and gold were much in demand for jewelry and for decoration of the temples. Because of their relative scarcity when compared with other goods, it took many common commodities to trade for very small quantities of silver and gold. It was not that silver and gold had any value of their own, but their relative scarcity allowed small amounts of them to be traded for large amounts of other things. It was this scarcity in ratio to the abundance of other things that gave them their value. So the Awalum, the haves, who wore silver and gold rings and bracelets and brooches, displayed their wealth by the large amounts of grain and goats that would be needed to trade for such jewelry. A silver bracelet that had cost 100 goats was an impressive piece of shiny metal to every farmer who only owned a few goats. Although the basic system of commerce in Mesopotamia was barter, silver became in all respects the money of the ancient Near East. It was bartered in shekel weights, and each shekel weighed about 8 grams. Using these weights and measures, we know what the wages and prices were in those ancient times. Silver was a barter commodity that evolved into a kind of commodity money that could be used as a medium of exchange for everything. A farmer might refuse to trade his grain for 100 weight of raw wool, but he would gladly trade it for a few shekel weights of silver. He could then trade the silver for some new garments for his wife, and for the new mortar and pestle and the baby goats that he really wanted. 1 lump of gold is of no use in commerce because the entire society cannot do business trading among themselves with 1 lump of gold. So, except between kings and bullion merchants and money changers who dealt in very large amounts, gold's rarity limited its usefulness as a type of money. Silver, however, is rare, but not so rare that it wasn't plentiful enough to be used as a medium of exchange. Although 1 lump of gold is useless in business, 100 lumps of silver begin to make the wheels of business turn as they were traded back and forth between buyers and sellers. Thus, silver became the basis of the monetary systems that developed in the ancient Near East. Silver itself is as worthless as sand. Whatever value it has is given to it by the mutual agreement of men. As a metal, it lasted for ages and did not deteriorate like cloth or cooking oil or grain or even the land itself. As long as it could be traded for anything in addition to acting as a form of money, it also became a method to store wealth. A ton of grain could be sold for silver. A parcel of land could be sold for silver. A slave could be sold for silver. A house could be sold for silver, and years later, when the grain was eaten, the land washed away by the river, the slave dead of old age, and the house fallen down in an earthquake, the silver could be taken out of its hiding place in fresh grain. More land, a young slave, and a new house could be bought with that silver. Silver thus became a very valuable and useful commodity metal that was recognized very early as useful both as a medium of exchange and as a storage of wealth. Anything could be sold for silver, and that silver could then buy anything else. Like a magical amulet, among a people who believed in magic and sorcery, anything could be turned into silver, and silver could be turned into anything. Silver was very much sought after by everyone who did any buying or selling in Mesopotamia. And those who did the buying and selling were the awalum, the haves. Great wealth also brought problems for the wealthy. Through lending at interest, the awalum, haves, began to acquire more land than they or their relatives could possibly farm. They acquired more foreclosed houses and fish ponds, and boats and farm animals than they could possibly manage themselves. Human resentments being what they are, the moneylenders found it difficult to hire a farmer to work on the same field that they had swindled from him. Farmers land to the grain and silver lenders preferred to start afresh by digging new irrigation ditches and cultivating new fields farther out in the desert. To solve his problem of too many foreclosed properties and untended flocks, the Ubaidian moneylenders began to hire laborers from the north of Mesopotamia. These northerners, Sumerians, were poor hunter-gatherers without farms or farming skills. In exchange for the usual wages of grain and oil, woven cloth and beer, they became the cheap immigrant laborers of pre-literate Mesopotamia. Using carefully controlled wages and strong-arm tactics from his foremen and enforcers, the awalum, haves, were able to keep these poor people hard at work. By the time of the arrival of the Sumerians, the southerners, the word for slave had become Sumerian. The moneylenders began to betray their own people to foreigners by using those foreigners as a means of securing ownership of the confiscated and foreclosed estates and properties. Although the archives name them as Sumerians, a name which, by the time the Sumerians arrived in Mesopotamia, meant slave, in fact, these names were not ethnic or tribal references at all. The four directions used by the Mesopotamian people were north, Subar, south, Sumer, west, Amaru, and east, Elam. And the city of Babylon later became the center of it all. Thus, the names of these people that have come down to us indicate not their ethnic or country of origin, but the direction from whence they came. As the moneylenders hired more and more Sumerians from the north to work the land, the displaced and foreclosed Ubaidians were forced to seek refuge in the temples as servants, or to hire themselves out as muskinim, have-not, laborers, or as tenant farmers. Once proud, land-owning farmers who had been among the class of awalum, the haves, were reduced to being landless paupers working for a daily bowl of barley porridge as the slaves of those who had lent to them at interest. This led to a great deal of rebelliousness among these displaced workers and resentments toward the awalum, the haves, and the tamkarum, merchant moneylenders. Tamkarum, Tamkarum, who had taken their farms and enslaved their children. Grumbling and threatening mobs of hungry muskinim, have-nots, were a growing threat to the moneylenders' security. The moneylenders found that they could deflect retribution and increase their profits by importing large numbers of foreign workers from the Subar, the north, to work the lands. These poor Sumerians did not ask so much for their pay, since they were happy to merely have a bowl of barley porridge and a pot of beer for their labor. And if the money-lending landlord gave them enough barley and beer for themselves and a wife, then he could hire a devoted worker. Surrounded by cheap immigrant labor, the displaced Ubaidian farmers became more docile when they found to their great terror that if they did not work for the awalum, the haves, as cheaply as the immigrants and without grumbling, then they would starve to death as the foreigner workers displaced them in the fields and in the brickyards. And so, huge tracts of land were worked both by foreign Sumerians, whom the moneylenders brought in from the north, and by the impoverished Ubaidians, who worked the estates of the temple and of the king. Thus, through moneylending, the Ubaidian people were defrauded of their homes and were displaced by the hired immigrant labor. They became servants on their own lands. But how can less developed and more primitive foreign people displace... Well, there goes my power. That's nice. Oh man. That sucks. Anyways. But how can less developed and more primitive foreign people displace the more advanced citizens of a country? There are 3 stages to this displacement, beginning with treason from above, found in the greed of the Tamkarung, merchant moneylenders. First, cheap foreign laborers are brought in by the moneylenders and landlords under the protection of their own high social status and their ownership of the land. The Ubaidian people accepted the ancient swindle that the awalum, the haves, can do what they want with their own property. This attitude was also accepted by the landowners whose property was next to the foreign tenant farmers because they saw no danger in denying what they considered to be their own rights as property owners. This attitude was also accepted by the grumbling itinerant workers. Let me look that up. Oh, maybe I didn't lose power. My lights just flickered was all. Itinerant, traveling from place to place. Itinerant, it says. Cool. Grumbling itinerant workers and debt slaves because they didn't have any choice. They were the voiceless and powerless have-nots. Thus, under cover of land ownership, the awalum, the haves, moved foreign workers into the country to work cheaply and increase their profits, while forcing the displaced workers into silence by threat of unemployment and starvation. Second, when foreign people live as minorities among any population where they are outnumbered, they usually assume a very friendly and cheerful and helpful attitude toward the majority population in an effort to be accepted and to blend into society. Through continuing friendliness, they tend to disarm the populace of distrust and resentment of their unasked-for presence. Through persistent friendliness, the danger that they pose is forgotten. And third, once the foreign population has grown to a number that approaches a nearly equal or superior number, they give up their previously cheerful and friendly attitude and begin to assert a more aggressive and acquisitive character as they strive to take for themselves the land and properties that are owned or rented by the original population. This is subversion and disenfranchisement from below. This is something that the devious moneylenders recognized at a very early stage in their success as parasites. And this is a 3-stage pattern that you will see is repeated over the next 7,000 years right up to the present times. Unlike small tribal societies where personal loyalties are of paramount importance, the distance that great wealth created between the rich and the poor gave the rich an impersonal interest in the poor. The Ubaidian moneylenders, shrewdly peering through their half-closed eyelids, swindled the land away and created a subclass of the working poor from among their own people. To further enrich themselves, they hired the even cheaper Sumerian laborers who undercut the pay scale of the people. As the Sumerian workers were immigrated in, the wages that the awalum, the haves, had to pay to their own people fell because of the competition from cheap labor. So, through foreign immigration, the social distance between the rich and the poor grew even wider and more impersonal. The Ubaidian landowners thought nothing of hiring foreigners, while their own people either starved or worked for starvation wages, if that's what it took to increase their own wealth. Even though they had displaced their own people, the moneylenders themselves were not displaced, since they were the property owners and the ones who promoted Sumerian labor on the foreclosed and confiscated farms. In their greed, the moneylenders sold vast properties to a foreign people from the Iranian plateau. These people entered Mesopotamia from the south. They brought with them abundant silver to buy up the foreclosed properties from the Ubaidian moneylenders. And within one generation, as their children learned the ways of the Ubaidian culture, these people from the south, from the Sumer, became the masters of the land. They were called Sumerians. After 1,000 years of usury, what property was not owned by the temples or the kings was owned by the moneylenders and a few independent farmers, all members of the social class of Awalim, the haves. But if the moneylenders wanted to sell some land, to whom could they sell it? The moneylenders could not sell to the temples because the priests considered all land to be the property of the gods. The priests would accept the land as a free will donation, but they would not buy it. The moneylenders could not sell to the kings because the kings in those days were not working for themselves, but were servants of the gods and protectors of the people. The kings also would want more land only if it was a gift. The moneylenders could not sell to other moneylenders or merchants because their own swindles they all had as much property as they could manage and would only buy at a ridiculously low price. So, the Ubaidian moneylenders sold their foreclosed farms to people from outside of Mesopotamia, to foreigners from the south, Sumer, and east, Elam, who had silver in abundance. These people are known to us as Sumerians simply because they arrived in Mesopotamia from the south, from the Sumer. The Sumerians were a much more intelligent people than the poor Subarians, the northerners. They knew a good thing when they saw it, and the agricultural abundance of Mesopotamia was what they wanted. The Sumerians were not interested in becoming the paid servants and the poor laborers of the Ubaidian landlords like the Subarians were. They had plenty of silver that they had dug out of the mountains of Elam, Iran. So they traded their silver bangles and rings for the farms and fields that the Awalim, the haves, owned. But the Sumerians were not fools. They could clearly see the advantages for themselves to occupy the land and the disadvantages of the Ubaidian farmers. So their natural suspicions prompted them to ask, "Why are you selling the land to us? Are you not betraying your own people by doing this?" But the wily merchants and moneylenders, expert salesmen that they were, always had a ready answer to overcome such an objection. "What are those people to us?" they replied. "They are not our friends, because they hate us and wish to do us harm. We have loaned them silver and helped them to buy land and purchase property. As mighty sin is our witness, we have done everything that we can to help them buy the best farms and the finest orchards. But still they hate us for our goodness and generosity, because they are full of hatred. But you are our friends, so we will give our friends a good deal in buying the land." And so the bargain was made. The Sumerians had no reason to hate the Ubaidian moneylenders yet. So they accepted the offers of cheap land, and to prove their friendship and generosity to the new immigrants, those Sumerians who could not afford the full price, the Ubaidians let them buy on time at low interest rates. Tornado warning. I think it'll end soon, I'm sure. Okay. Like blood-sucking fleas, the moneylenders jumped from their old victims who hated them onto their new victims who innocently accepted the moneylenders as their friends and guides and mentors. The ancient snake, with soft words and low interest rates, coiled around its prey. Its bite would come later. The Ubaidian moneylenders made huge fortunes in land sales, but in the process they betrayed their entire country to foreigners, not only by hiring cheap foreign labor as in the case with the poor Subarians from the north, but by actually selling the land to the Sumerians from the south, and they had accomplished this by only using the fraud of loaning at simple interest, which was all that illiterate people could calculate. Of course, as the moneylenders saw it, they were the owners of the land and had a right to sell it to whomever they chose. But in actual fact, nearly every shekel of silver and every parcel of land that they had was a result of stealing and defrauding their own people through the swindles of money lending and confiscating of collateral. They were robber barons selling off their loot. Because this system of lending at interest had existed long before the Sumerians arrived, they accepted this false idea without a second thought. After all, by the time the Sumerians arrived, the cities and towns of Mesopotamia were already over 3,000 years old. It appeared that the political and economic systems of Mesopotamia had always been here. So they accepted the entire system without question. The interest on a loan, the Sumerians called mas, a word used for both calves and interest. So this idea that interest could increase magically like the birth of a calf concealed the swindle from its earliest inception. That the interest was a swindle was known only to the moneylenders. As the new landowners, the Sumerians brought in more and more of their relatives from the south until they became so numerous that the Ubaidian inhabitants of Mesopotamia entirely disappeared as an ethnic group, and the land came under the complete domination and power of the Sumerians. These people greatly improved upon what the Ubaidians had developed, and they produced inventions of their own. So, they are credited as being the founders of civilization. In addition to their many positive contributions to mankind, they are the ones who developed the Sumerian Swindle to its highest level of fraud and passed it along to the modern world as the demonic invention known as compound interest. With their keen intelligence, they could see the potential of what inventions the Ubaidians had. Since necessity is the mother of invention, they transformed the crude scratches on clay into a robust system of writing and mathematical calculation. However, writing was not invented to record great poetry, epic myths, or novels. Writing was not invented to write down prayers and songs in praise of the gods. For millennia, poetry and epic tales of the gods and heroes had been transmitted orally by the bards, storytellers, and singers. So, there was no necessity to invent writing for that. What was needed was a method for recording the baskets of grain, the pots of beer, the numbers of ducks, and the various other commodities that were traded among the merchants and farmers. Writing was originally invented as an accounting tool. As early as 10,000 BC, the Ubaidians had used tokens of clay shaped as spheres, cones, rods, and discs, the size of small marbles, for simple household and market bookkeeping. This system worked well enough for 6,000 years in Mesopotamia, developing with a variety of squiggles on the sides of the discs to record numbers. During those 6,000 years, the Ubaidians built large mud brick towns and towering mud brick temples, while not even one person knew how to read or write. 6,000 years is a long time to be illiterate, and before that, as hunter-gatherers, mankind did quite well for several millions of years without reading or writing a single word. But to keep track of their pots of beer, now that was something about which no one wanted to lose count. Around 3500 BC, it was discovered that those commodities that were represented by clay, things, could more easily be represented as scratches incised upon wet clay. Instead of having a heavy basket full of clay discs that represented the sacks of wool and pots of beer and baskets of grain that were owned by a temple or by a rich merchant, those commodities were found to be more efficiently recorded by a few squiggles and lines on a tablet of clay no bigger than one's open palm. With this invention, a 30-kilogram basket of clay discs and spheres was replaced by a 1/8 kilogram clay tablet with markings on it that could record a whole city full of baskets filled with clay markers. Writing and numbers were a fantastic use of miniaturization 4,000 years before there were any Japanese. Writing and numbers were a fantastic use of miniaturization for 4,000 years before there were any Japanese. When the Sumerians realized that the potential power and usefulness of those scratches on wet clay, they improved upon them and created a complete writing and counting system known to us as cuneiform writing. Writing was invented not by novelists and poets in need of expressing their artistic urges, but by the bean counters in need of keeping track of their beans. With the invention of writing, both time and distance were changed in relation to mankind. Distances were made shorter and time was made irrelevant. The simple clay writing tablets of the Sumerians erased the destructive influence of time itself, because even the faintest markings on the clay tablets could carry the written ideas across the millennia to where our present-day scholars can read the very words of those ancient people. Think of the possibilities that opened up with the invention of writing. Contracts and treaties could be stored for eons without a single word of the original agreement, without losing a single word of the original agreement. Distant kings could communicate with one another in words that could not be changed by either forgetfulness or distance. Without having to make perilous journeys, merchants could order exact amounts of goods with agreed-upon prices from suppliers in distant countries. Contracts for the sale and rental of fields and farms with agreed-upon payments and time schedules could be written down as proof of any business arrangements, and these could be stored for centuries without losing a single word in the contract or the smallest grain of silver in the payment. With writing, the Sumerians were able to weld the small villages and towns into powerful states through the power of communication. And all of this was accomplished with marks made upon wet clay, without a single television program or Hollywood movie to interfere with their cultural progress. However great the invention of writing was for making complex civilization possible, it was the people who controlled the writing who also controlled those complex civilizations. Since writing was actually invented by the merchants, then the merchants were the ones who first and foremost benefited from writing. And if a merchant did not know how to read and write, he could always hire a scribe to do it for him. But here is a curious fact. However great an invention that writing is, how much attention do you give to it? Every day do you look at some written words and sigh great oohs and ahs at the very wonderfulness of written words? Or do you think nothing of reading and writing whatsoever? When you want to read or write something, you merely read and write. Don't you take for granted the reading and writing because you have been familiar with it for most of your life? I am setting up a trap here, so be careful. The same can be said of the invention of the wheel. This simple device, which was also invented in Mesopotamia, carries the entire modern world. We would not have an industrial or even an efficient rural society without the wheel to drive our vehicles and turn our machinery. But do you stop in awe and stare and wonder every time an automobile drives by and point your finger in excitement at the rolling wheels and say, "Oh look, a wheel, look, a whole bunch of wheels"? Of course not. Wheels are so common, and they have been around since before we were born, so we take them for granted as an ordinary part of life. I am setting up a trick here, so be careful. That which has existed since before we were born is something that everybody takes for granted. Automobiles, glass windows, forks and spoons, telephones, and a million other items are examples of things to which we don't give a second thought, since they have always been here. We all grew from a baby to an adult with these inventions all around us, right? Now be careful, I am setting up a trick here. But you know from your study of history that automobiles, glass windows, telephones, etc. have not really been here forever. You may even know from your modern collection of trivial information the names of the people who invented these things, and even the dates when they were invented. But what could the ancient Mesopotamians know about the inventions of their own people? Literally, they could know nothing at all because all of their inventions were made before writing was developed. Thanks to the archaeologists, we know that between the first small villages of the Ubaidians and the beginnings of genuine civilization with the Sumerians, an amazing 6,000 years had gone by. 6,000 years of people sowing and reaping, raising their families and dying, and not one of them being able to read or write. I am setting up a trick here, so be careful and think about this a bit. Let me stop and take a swig. Okay. In relation to your own life, think about your own country and its history. Think about your own relatives and your own family, and put this into perspective. If your parents are still living, do you remember your grandparents? What about your great-grandparents? Can you remember them? Aside from some old photographs, what can you really say about your great-grandparents? And certainly there is very little, if anything, that you can remember about your great-great-grandparents, since they died before you were born. And what can you know about your distant relatives from 100 years ago? And even though you can read and write, what can you say about your relatives who lived 5,000 years ago? 5,000 years ago you had living relatives. You exist, so certainly they did too. But there is absolutely nothing that you can say about any of them. Dust as they are, blowing in the wind, and imaginary spooks conjured up in your own mind. Be careful, there is a trick coming up here. Time is money, or so the modern capitalists and financiers who daily use both time and money to increase their profits and betray the world. So of course it is important to understand time if you want to understand the people who use time to swindle you out of your money. 5,000 years is really a very short time. But to modern people at the beginning of the 21st century AD, 5,000 years seems to be ancient and remote, because everything changes so much in modern times. We tend to view 100 years ago as quaintly antique, while 5,000 years ago seems impossibly ancient. 5,000 years is beyond the modern human's comprehension. However, it is important to understand why a few thousand years is really a very short time, because as I show you the secrets of the Jews and moneylenders, you must understand that long periods of time are not a barrier to conspiracies such as this. If you look at the entire known universe and put all of that into a ratio of a single calendar year, you can begin to get an idea of how relatively recent is 5,000 years ago. That is, if you count the very beginning of the universe as starting on January 1st and the end of that calendar year as ending today, as you are reading this, you can get an excellent idea of the relatively short time that 5,000 years really is. Beginning with the Big Bang of expanding gases on January 1st, the Earth didn't form until September 14th, more than 3/4 of the way through the year. The oldest fossils of green algae and bacteria weren't laid down until October 9th, and the first photosynthetic plants were formed by about November 12th. And by December 1st, oxygen began to infuse the Earth's atmosphere. The first worms began to form by December 16th. The first fishes began by December 19th. The first trees and reptiles began about December 23rd, and the first dinosaurs by December 24th. The first mammals began by December 26th, and the first birds by December 27th. The dinosaurs became extinct by December 28th, and by December 29th the first primates evolve. And by December 31st, the first humans appear by about 10:30 p.m. By 11 p.m. on December 31st, people learn to use stone tools. And by 11:46 p.m., we learn to use fire. By 11:59 p.m., the hunters of Europe begin drawing pictures on their cave walls. By 11:59 p.m. and 20 seconds, agriculture is invented. And by 11:59 p.m. and 50 seconds, recorded history at Sumeria begins. And thus, as a ratio of man's life on Earth against the age of the universe, all of our recorded history since writing was invented has taken place within just that last 10 seconds. Brilliant. Since writing was invented, it has taken place within just the last 10 seconds. But of course, this is just a ratio and in no way can make one comprehend even small lengths of time such as a mere 5,000 years. I'm setting up a trick here, so be careful. It is important to realize how very recent a time span 5,000 years is and not to be deceived into assuming that people are any different today than they were then. In all of that time, we have invented into our daily lives both material things and intellectual ideas that are just as useful to us today as they were to the people of 5,000 years ago. The wheel was invented 5,500 years ago, and what would we do without it? Because wheels are such ancient technology, should we throw them aside and never ride bicycles or automobiles or trains because as modern people such ancient relics are too old for us? How absurd. And writing was invented 5,000 years ago, but since you are reading this, you know that such an ancient invention is too useful to do without. How could we carry on our civilized lives without reading and writing? We are really quite young, we human beings. The span of our lives against the vastness of creation is very small. The whirling and wheeling of the galaxies in limitless space do little for us and certainly take no heed of our existence. It is the life that we lead in the present moment that means anything at all. Of what use it is to know the distance to Alpha Centauri or the speed of light around a black hole. None of this matters at all in our daily lives. But how fast a wheel spins that carries us along a freeway, or what time the train arrives to carry us to work, means quite a lot, because these things in real time and in real space directly impact our very lives. I'm setting up a trick here, so be careful. Can you begin to understand the incredible time frames that we are dealing with? Your inability to say anything about your own relatives of 5,000 years ago is no different than the problem that the Mesopotamians had in saying anything about their own relatives. In fact, you probably know more than they did, since genealogy and photography and archaeology and writing have preserved enough that you can at least make a guess. So let's solve the problem of the tricks that I have set. In trying to remember your distant relatives, you can now understand the impossible problem of trying to remember people whom you have never met. Furthermore, by taking for granted the man-made inventions in our daily lives, we tend to forget that these things are here today, but they were not always here. Were wheels always here? No. Were telephones always here? No. Was writing always here? No. But it is easy to take them for granted because they are so familiar in our daily lives. We don't think twice about seeing a spoon or a fork or a pair of chopsticks, an automobile or an airplane or a book because they have been here since before we were born. We take them for granted. So here is the trick. Understand this about the Sumerian swindle. It was not always here. The Ubaidians of 5000 BC invented it, and the Sumerians took it up, and through writing and mathematics increased its power 1,000,000,000,000-fold. The Sumerian swindle is an ancient secret that modern scientists totally fail to understand, and yet it has already been used throughout history to destroy entire nations and extinguish the lives of millions of people. This ancient Sumerian swindle is being used today by the Jews and financiers and bankers to destroy entire countries and swindle generations of people and to create despotic tyrannies that crush freedom, enslave mankind, and throw down God. The Sumerian swindle has that kind of power. It has that kind of power, and yet modern man takes it for granted as a normal part of life, and so allows the swindle to prosper. It was invented in Mesopotamia, yet it is overlooked by archaeology, misunderstood by politicians, and invisible to the common man. The secrets of the Sumerian swindle have been closely guarded for over 7,000 years, and are still being held in the greedy and power-mad hands of some of the most evil fiends ever to have walked the earth. This super-secret invention of the Sumerians was not nuclear weapons or jet fighter planes. Nothing as amazing as that. The super-secret Sumerian swindle is quite simply the loaning of money at both simple and compound interest. Take care, there's a trick here. This boring subject of lending at interest has created and destroyed individual people and entire nations for the past 7,000 years. Hundreds of millions of people have starved to death. Wars have ravaged the nations of mankind. Diseases have spread. Hundreds of millions of people have been enslaved and worked to death. Entire nations have arisen to great heights of culture and have been laid waste with fire and pestilence, all because of the Sumerian swindle. With such power inflicted upon us from ancient times, how can we not want to understand the very thing that destroys our families, robs us of our wealth, steals our jobs, forecloses our homes, pushes us into wars, betrays our country, and enslaves us? You, O modern man, might think that you understand the modern world because you take the modern world for granted, but the modern world is in the grip of an ancient evil that arose long, long ago in the land of Sumeria. The Sumerian swindle is practiced today by every thieving banker, perfidious Jew, and treasonous financier, but it has not always been here. Ho-hum, boring, what's so secret about compound interest? You may wonder as you take for granted something that was here before you were born. To get an appreciation for this power, consider the parable of Joseph's penny. The parable. Take a swig. The parable of Joseph's penny goes like this. If, at the birth of Jesus, Joseph had lent... If, at the birth of Jesus, Joseph had loaned out 1 penny at a compound interest rate of 5%, how much would be in the account today if Jesus returned to collect on the investment? If, at the birth of Jesus, Joseph had loaned out 1 penny at a compound interest rate of 5%, how much would be in the account today if Jesus returned to collect on the investment? The answer to this is simple. To this simple question has some very amazing results. If the interest was calculated yearly for 2,000 years, then Jesus would be able to withdraw in dollars an amount equal to $24 times 10 to the 39th power. That is, in dollars, $24 with 39 zeros after it. Shit. Oh, excuse me. The language. I don't even know what that number is. Couldn't tell you. 24 with 39 zeros after it. Very few people can even pronounce or read such a huge number, let alone comprehend such a stupendous amount of money. So that's at a compound interest rate of 5% over 2,000 years. 24 with 39 zeros. Or, if the compound interest was calculated daily, then Jesus could withdraw in dollars $267 with 39 zeros after it. These amounts of money would be several spheres of gold the size of the planet Earth. It's hard to believe, but you can calculate it out for yourself to verify these numbers. That is the power of compound interest on just 1 penny. But these numbers also reflect the banker's tricks with time. Secret fraud number 10 of the Sumerian Swindle is time benefits the banker and betrays the borrower. So, perhaps some readers can understand why the bankers claim that they are charging you, let's say 15% interest on your credit card, but they calculate the compound interest daily rather than yearly. You assume that you are paying 15%, and they do indeed calculate your interest at 15%. But by calculating the interest daily, adding that to what you owe, and then the next day calculating interest on top of that, the banker devils make over 10 times more than what they can steal from you by calculating the interest yearly. Over 10 times more, even though they are still allegedly charging the same 15%. That's amazing. Absolutely amazing. At first, the amounts owed in interest are relatively small, but in compound interest, as the interest owed is added to the principal, and interest is then calculated upon that sum, the amounts skyrocket with an ever steeper acceleration until it becomes absolutely impossible to pay off the huge debt, and the debtor becomes bankrupt and enslaved. That's the Sumerian Swindle in its ultimate summation, using compound interest to betray and impoverish all of mankind. Any modern person who has fallen into house mortgage and credit card debt has been swindled in this way. Again, for comparison, what would be the amount of Joseph's penny if, instead of compound interest as calculated above, the interest was calculated as simple interest? For the same penny, for the same 5% per year, for the same period of 2,000 years, the amount that Jesus would be able to withdraw would total a mere $1.01, or 101 pennies. Are you beginning to comprehend the incredible grand larceny that was then and is today being committed by the moneylenders, bankers, and financiers? They are all swindling criminals, without exception. The Sumerian Swindle has been used to betray both the people of the ancient as well as the people of the modern world. Even the simple interest of lending out 2 baskets of grain to get back 3 is a swindle. Or, for those modern people who have fallen into the banker's trap of buying a home on credit, here's something to think about. Even at simple interest of 5%, if you pay a $100,000 home on a 30-year mortgage, you will end up paying off the loan after 30 years for a total of $250,000. Even at simple interest, you are really not paying 5% to own a home. You are actually paying a total of 150%, which is an extra $150,000 over the $100,000 price of the home. More than double the original price. The home does not increase in value, rather the money decreases in value through the automatic inflation created by the Sumerian Swindle. But home loans are calculated with compound interest. Using the same amounts at compound interest, a $100,000 home costs an extra $332,194 for a total of $432,194. In other words, you are actually paying over 400% for your home, not 5%. Thus, inflation is an automatic result of lending at interest. Prices keep going up because the bankers are allowed to swindle both the government and the people of our wealth. Such are the frauds of the modern bankers. But it gets much worse, as is described in Volume 3, The Bloodsuckers of Judah. The above shows the powers of compound interest in creating huge debts that the people have to pay to the bankers who do no more to earn it than holding out the palm of their hands. In a nutshell, the mechanics of the Sumerian swindle works this way. Numbers are infinite. You can multiply and achieve infinite sums quickly, but real things are finite. It is impossible for infinite numbers to equal real things in quantity because real things are not infinite. So, when a banker uses infinite numbers to multiply real things, he is swindling you because he is asking the impossible. He is asking you to give him more real things than actually exist. A loan of $10 times 50% means that the numbers claim that they have multiplied and created a real thing by 50%, but that's impossible. Yes, you can say that if I loan you 2 apples at 50%, that you owe me 3 apples. And you can pay me the 3 apples from the millions of other apples that exist. But this does not mean that the business math equation is true. It is still faulty, and its fault is hidden in the indefinitely large number of apples that exist. But indefinitely large numbers are still far smaller in number than infinite numbers. Even though the huge number of apples on the planet are indefinitely large, they are not infinite in number. They are still not large enough in numbers to pay off the interest rate of the loan without stealing apples from some other location. And that's how bankers balance their books, by juggling the numbers, stealing from some other location to fill in the false sums that cannot possibly exist. In another example, suppose I own all of the gold on Earth and loan it to you at 50% interest. Can you pay me back my gold plus half again as much? No. It is impossible because all the gold on Earth is all that there is. So it is impossible to pay back a loan of real things by using infinite numbers. All banking is a swindle. All bankers are criminals. And that concludes an amazing chapter 3. I'll pick back up with chapter 4 tomorrow.